G'day, Michael from ironbarkgamesstudio, and welcome to the sixth part of this series, which will take you through the process of UV mapping the character in preparation for texturing. An easy way to understand UV mapping is considering how you would create a cube out of a flat piece of paper. You need to measure out the squares on the paper, cut around the outside of the shape, and then fold the squares at 90-degree angles to form each side of the cube. UV mapping is just the opposite of that, where you start with a cube, or any 3D object, and you need to work backwards to form the flat shape. You'll need to create cuts or seams, which then allows you to unfold the sides. Ideally, you want as few cuts as possible, and you want to unfold the mesh so there are a few distortions as possible. Both of these will help with making the textures look as good as possible. Jumping back into Blender, I have my high poly mesh here, finished from last video, and I do believe in the last video I forgot to add the bevels to the helmet eye, so don't forget to add in your bevel modifier there and mark all the edges. But I'm not going to be using any of the high poly meshes in this video today. I'm just going to hide all of those, and I'm going to turn on the low poly meshes there. With the exception of the capsules, which I've put in their own collection, I'm going to turn those off. All I need is the one capsule because the others are linked to it. I'm going to work on the body first, so I'm going to select that, and I'm going to head across to the UV editing window here. I'm also going to press / to isolate, so I only have to see the body. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the UV sync selection button at the top left of the UV editor. And as you can see, the UV mapping for the body is an absolute mess. Because we did start off with a cube, it will have the sort of rough outline of a cube in here, but as we've added extrusions and edge cuts, it's got more and more messy, and obviously this isn't going to be suitable for our UV map when texturing. The next thing I'm going to turn on under options is the live UV unwrap. So what this does is whenever I add in a seam, it's going to unwrap automatically over on this panel here what I've done. So let's start adding in some seams. So I'm going to let's go into edge selection, and I'm going to select the outside of the leg here, and with this edge loop selected, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go mark seam. That's going to add this red outline around here, and it's also going to unwrap the UV map on the left hand side here. Obviously it's still a mess, but we can see that we've split our UV map into two shells. One is for the body and the other one is for the leg. If you want to select a full shell, just select a vertex face or edge, press L, that's going to select the whole thing, so you can see that we've separated this full leg out from the body. Let's start adding in some additional cuts. So I'm going to come around to the base of the feet here, and just holding down Alt and Shift to select lines of edges, right click, mark seam. That will unfold it in the UV window. Now we can see the base of the foot is looking pretty good, but we'll need to keep marking seams to nicely unwrap the other pieces there. So I'm going to come up and select a line of edges on the inside of the leg. And we want our seams to be relatively out of the way, so that when we're texturing it, we don't get obvious seams in the texture. Right click, mark seam. And the leg is looking a lot nicer now. There is still a little problem in here with our little fin extrusion. So I'm going to come in here, select that loop, mark seam, that's going to cut it out. And when we're UV unwrapping, we're typically going to want to avoid circular shaped shells. So if we see a circular shell in our UV window, there's probably something wrong with our cuts. So in the case of the fin here, it's looking like a bit of a mess. So I'm going to create a cut along the inside here. Mark that, and that's going to nicely unfold it into more of a cone or a point. So avoid circular shells, unless the shape is actually a circle. Let's cut out the arms now. And I'm going to cut it off around the wrist. We also want to cut off the fin around the back. We know what we have to do with this one. Create a cut going up the inside. create sort of that cone shape there. For the arm, we're going to need a seam running along underneath it. There we go, straighten that out like the leg. And then for the hand, I'm going to create a cut around 1/2 of it. Just holding down Control and Shift to select those lines in between. You can only go a little bit at a time, otherwise it's going to mess up the selection. Coming down to the thumb, I'm just going to split it at the front, but I'm not going to take it all the way around underneath here. This is just going to save us one more seam to clean up when we're texturing. Let's mark that seam there. And we have this effect with the hand, so it's sort of unfolded with the thumb still being attached. Moving on to the body, we're still sort of seeing those circles in there, so we want to get rid of those. Let's create a cut down one side. This side's probably more out of the way. And we'll create a cut along here. And we're going to create a cut that sort of goes around the strap of the armor. So it's okay to separate the armor out from the rest of the body. Mark that. And then let's come to the front and just mark away the outside of that armor there. It's probably still going to be a little bit of a problem in here with the neck. We don't want it stretching too much, so let's cut out this little thing here. And that's looking pretty good in our UV window here. Now we do want to test this out a bit more visually in terms of how the texture is going to be applied to it. So we're going to create a texture grid material. So we're going to go to the materials here. Currently we have the default material assigned, which was assigned to the cube when we added it to the scene. I'm going to click on the plus here. And I'm going to create a new material. And I'm going to call this something like UV grid. Then I'm going to select the default material and just remove it. We do need to get out of edit mode to do this, so hit tab, remove that material there, and now we've just got the UV grid as the main material that's affecting in the mesh. I'm going to come across to the UV window now, and under here I'm going to click on new, and I'm going to call this new texture UV grid. I want the width and height to be nice and big. I'm going to make this 4K. So instead of typing 4096, I'm just going to come in here and type *4, and that's going to times it by 4. *4. And then for the generator type, I'm going to set it from blank to UV grid. You could also use color grid if you wanted to, but I think UV grids are a bit easier to visualize. And I'm going to go OK. So that's going to create this grid over the view here. But really we want to apply it in the 3D view on the right hand side. It's really hard to tell how this is affecting the mesh. We need it displayed on the actual mesh itself. So in the UV grid material, I'm going to come down to the base color. I'm going to click on this little yellow circle here, and I'm going to go to image texture. And then in the drop down texture, I'm just going to go to the UV grid, which we just created. I now need to switch the viewport shading in my 3D editor to viewport shading. And now we can see those squares displayed on the 3D object itself. I'm now going to click on the X in the UV grid here. I don't really like seeing the UV map in my UV window. I prefer to see it on the mesh, but if that helps you visualize it better, you can always leave the UV grid on in there. So now that we've got that set up, we can see that it's actually looking pretty nice. What we're looking for is that all of these squares are roughly the same size and that they are squares. If the UV shells are stretched, then these squares are also going to be stretched, and that's going to affect our texture. It's not quite done yet because we have a mirror modifier applied to this. So unless you want both sides of your character to be identical, you do need to apply the mirror modifier. So So I'm going to come into the modifier properties. I need to exit edit mode to apply it. So drop down and then apply. I'll head back into edit mode. This won't automatically unwrap it again, but we can see now that we've got shells overlapping each other. So I'm going to tap L to select that full shell there. I might just hit 3 to go into face selection so I don't select any of the other ones. Press G to grab. We can see that those shells are overlapping each other. Now again, this is perfectly fine if you want to save on texture space and you want one side of your model to be the exact same as the other. But in this case, I do want a little bit of variation between the two. So I'm going to hit A to select all of my faces. I'm going to hit U to open up the UV mapping window. And then I'm going to manually select Unwrap. That's also going to solve the effect down the middle here, where the squares were not quite lined up to each other. We could see a really obvious seam. Now they're nice and straight. So now it's the process of applying the UV mapping to all of the other meshes. So I'm going to hit Tab, / to get out of Isolate. And let's go through these one by one. So if we select the eyes and the head, and let's just / to isolate those. We want to apply the material, the UV mapping material to both of those, so UV grid and UV grid. We can see with the head, it doesn't actually have, well, it has a very, very bad default UV grid layout because this was created with a single plane when we retopologized it, whereas the others are going to have this default unwrapping here. So one thing for the eyes is that you're never really going to be able to see the backs of them. So in theory, we could delete some of these faces here. If the eyes are really going to be rotated around a lot, then maybe not. But I don't plan on animating the eyes that much, so I'm just going to select these faces there, and I'm just going to delete them. I'm now going to select the whole eye with A, U, and Unwrap, and we just get this sort of front-on circular projection. We want to make sure that there's enough detail sort of in the front where the iris is going to be. So if we really wanted to, we could create another cut in here. So if I hit 2 to go into edge selection, make a cut there, mark seam, that's going to give us a little bit better definition in the front. We're going to keep the mirror modifier for the eyes. Each eye is going to be identical. If you wanted to have different textured eyes, then you'll need to apply it and then move out one of the shells that's overlapping the other. For the head though, we do need to apply the mirror modifier, so I'm going to do that now. And I'm going to add a cut that comes from around the forehead, and I'm going to bring it all the way around the back of the crest here, down to the neck, and mark that. And this should give us a pretty good unwrap here. We want to make sure that there's not too much stretching and that these squares are fairly equal in size. We can see that the chin is lacking a little bit of density. If you really wanted to, you could add another cut coming up here around the chin. That's going to add a little bit more texture density to this area, but it is also going to create a seam. So it's up to you if you want this extra seam you have to deal with, or if you're just going to lose out on a bit of texture density. So I'm going to exit edit mode, I'm going to hit / to get everything else back, and let's have a crack at one of the armor pieces. So I'm going to select this piece of armor here, / to isolate, go into my materials, add our UV grid there. And we don't need to apply the mirror modifier here. It's going to be okay if our armor pieces mirror identically. Again, if you really wanted to have different textures for different pieces, you could do that, but I'm going to save on the texture space. So let's add some seams in some non-obvious areas, and we'll need to cut up the inside. Do need to unfold this little box on top. And let's cut out these little circle bits on the front. That's just going to make those nice and straight as well. We can see if we hide that bit, we've still got an issue along here. So I might just select these seams. I'm going to right click and clear them instead. And let's just actually just cut all the way through and see how that looks. Yeah, and I think that's going to look a lot nicer. So we're probably going to have a little bit of stretching in there, but overall we're going to get a better effect. Tab, get out of isolate, select the next bit here, isolate, add the UV grid material. No need to apply the modifier, we can keep that as is, and let's apply some cuts. So let's cut this whole piece out here. We'll avoid a bit of texture stretching, so we'll add cuts there. Going to want to cut underneath the armor. Just want to cut this box all the way off from the mesh beneath it. Okay, I think that's looking good there. /. Let's select the next piece. This one, we're going to want to apply the mirror modifier just for one piece. So I'm going to deselect the x-axis. Let's apply that. Let's add the mirror modifier again. And just leave it on the x. So now we can just fully unwrap one piece. And let's not forget to apply that UV grid material. For the helmet, I might not apply the mirror modifier right away. We'll do one side first and then the other. Okay, once we're happy with that, we can apply the mirror modifier and see how it looks. And then select everything, unwrap. Okay, let's tackle the backpack next. Again, let's not apply the mirror just yet. See some stretching in there for some reason. So I haven't quite cut it off at a place. Question is where? There it is there. There we go, it's separated out the shell. For your hard surface objects, it's nice to add these seams around the hard edges of the model. Just makes things a little bit neater, and it kind of just conforms to the shape of the model anyway. Okay, I think that's looking good, so let's apply that mirror modifier. And once again, unwrap. There's something going on here. There's a little bit of stretching. So if I just go into face selection, press 3, and then L to select that shell. Probably want to come up to the top and add some cuts just because it's stretching a little bit too much. So let's try along here. Yeah, that's looking a fair bit better. So if it's warping too much, better just add some cuts and make it a little bit less stretched. Good for the backpack. Nice like that. Straps are next. Looking good, except these little details stretch, so let's cut those edges. Okay, let's have the mirror modifier for that one. Unwrap that. Cloth should be pretty straightforward. So let's just apply the mirror immediately. Add our UV grid and unwrap it from there. Don't think we need to make any cuts or changes from that. Same with the other bit of cloth. Let's just apply the mirror modifier, add the grid material, and just UV unwrap it without adding any cuts. Let's just see what this looks like unwrapped. I think it's going to be fine without having to make any more cuts, so tiny bit of stretching maybe come in here and add some cuts to these sides. Alright, apply the mirror modifier. Okay, let's set a cut right at the back there. Do the knee. Okay, and the final part, we have our capsule here. Now again, we don't need to unwrap all of these capsules here, because if we unwrap one, it's also going to unwrap all of the other ones. So I'll just show you that now. And as you can see, now all of the different capsules have the same UV mapping. Okay, so we've got all of our different pieces marked and unwrapped, but now we need to put them all together on the same texture grid. So all of our shells need to fit within this grid space here. We don't want anything overlapping or going over the edges, because that's going to bleed onto the other side. We also want to avoid shells overlapping each other unless they are identical pieces. So in the case of the two pieces of armor, they can overlap because they're going to have the same texture. But if we have a look at all of our meshes, so just select all of them and then hit tab, you can see that they're all overlapping each other, and this just ain't going to work for texturing. You could use multiple UV grids if you're going to have multiple textures on your character, but we're just going to have one grid, one material, one texture. So with all of the meshes selected, I'm going to hit A to select everything, U, and then unwrap. From here, you could use this UV map to do your texturing, or you could make some little adjustments. So if you do want to make adjustments, make sure to turn off your live unwrap. So if you accidentally create a new cut, it's not going to redo your entire layout. And this is where you could come in here, identify the different pieces, and essentially just move around, rotate them, get them into positions that you want. So if you want to select the full shell, just select part of it, hit L, that's going to select the full thing. If you are in vertex selection, it will select the vertices sort of attached to the other sides, so just hit 3 to go into face selection, and then you could just say rotate this. So in this case, both leg shells are going to be rotated in the one direction. This can help with lining up textures, it can help with identifying pieces that you need to texture similarly, but in the end it's not really going to make a difference to the texture itself, it's more of a convenience factor to you. So if you want to spend some time cleaning up this UV map, and that saves you on the texturing, go for it. Otherwise you can pretty much leave it as is. The main thing here is that we use up as much of this space as possible, and there's as few gaps as possible, because gaps with no texture on it, that is just wasted space. You may also decide to give particular shells more density than others. So as we can see, all of these squares are pretty much identical size to each other, but say if you wanted to give some extra resolution to the head, so let's just go into vertex, Control L, select the helmet, press H to hide, and grab the head shell here. If I come in here and I scale this up, you can see that these squares become smaller, and that means your texture is going to have a higher resolution. Typically speaking though, you will want all of your shells to have the same resolution, otherwise it can get distracting. You never want a piece to become too blurry, or something to become much clearer than all the others. Alright, and that is UV mapping. So a good UV map is going to go a long way in improving the overall look of your model when the textures are done, so it is not a step worth rushing. However, you can always come back to your UV map and make adjustments during the texturing stage, so you're not locked in here to this particular map. You can make little adjustments later on. The next tutorial is going to cover the final bit of setup required for the models in Blender before texturing. Then we will get the high and low poly models into Substance Painter, and we're going to bake the high poly details onto the low poly mesh. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you found it useful. You can check out our Patreon link in the description for a variety of rewards such as starting files, tutorial notes, and early access to the rest of the series, and I'll see you in the next one.